Hey, Richard, do you lose your gun rights if you live with a felon?
Today, we're talking about whether or not a person loses their gun rights simply because they live with a felon here in the state of Texas. And I'm going to say, stick around to the very end because we have some kind of practical tips and pitfalls that we think are extremely helpful. We got this question from the folks over on Reddit, but before we begin, hit that like button, show your support for the Second Amendment, and let's start our discussion. And we can't start without talking about the federal and Texas law. So, Em, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, and this is one of those really interesting parts of the law where Texas law and federal law aren't completely in agreement, which is why we have to talk about both. The federal law says that once you are a convicted felon, so you have been convicted of an offense for which you could have been punished by more than a year in the penitentiary, you are unfortunately a convicted felon. Even if you didn't actually spend that time in jail or prison, you could have just been placed on probation. You're still a convicted felon if you were convicted of that offense, and you could have been sentenced to that amount of incarceration. So if that's you, what you've got is a forever prohibition on owning and purchasing firearms on the federal level. That's different than Texas. Texas says that for 5 years after your, criminal defense attorneys, we like to call it off paper, right? Basically the last time you had interaction with the criminal justice system, whether that's your release from incarceration, your discharge from probation, or your release from parole, 5 years after that date, you can possess firearms in the home only for that purpose of self-defense. You cannot leave the home with them.
And so when we're talking about this, a lot of people think, I have a license to carry, or I'm a gun owner, and, I live with a felon. What are my rights? How does this impact me? And really it comes down to transferring or, allowing a felon to gain access to firearms because, somebody else's issue or adjudication or conviction, that shouldn't impact us. And I think we all kind of understand that kind of feels wrong that we would lose our rights because of something else that someone else did. And so what we're really guarding against is transferring or letting felons gain access to firearms, because while it may not be it would be a crime for us to intentionally give a gun to a felon. That'd be a crime under both state and federal law. But so long as we're not doing those intentional transfers, what we really fall into is we don't want the person that we're living with to get in trouble. We don't want them to get in trouble for being a felon in possession of a firearm, for example. And so what we're really guarding against is felons getting access to firearms. Now, where do you see this come up most often, Emily?
Yeah, this comes up most often in the vehicle. And I think even we should step back a little bit and say, we're talking about felon in possession of a firearm. What does possession mean? It means that the firearm is in that person's care, custody, control, or management. And so this is a big hot topic in the vehicle because this is probably, we're all law-abiding citizens for the most part here. That's probably the place you encounter law enforcement most often. You speed, you run a stop sign. What is that officer going to do when your spouse, who's a convicted felon, is sitting right next to you and you're an LTC holder, you've got your handgun in the car? Well, they're going to look at whose possession the firearm was in. And, we can talk practically about what that means. I can tell you right off the bat, if it is on your body, you probably are doing right by the law, doing right by your spouse or friend who's a convicted felon. It's really hard to argue that when I'm carrying on my person, that my firearm is in, let's say, Richard's possession.
Right. And so, like Emily said, vehicles where this comes up most often. So keeping it exclusively in your control, that kind of cuts the prosecution's, legs off when saying, oh, this other person was possessing it. So another scenario that comes up a lot is shared vehicle. For example, sometimes I will place a handgun in my center console or glove box. And if I accidentally forget that it's in there, and let's say a felon came in and had to run errands or something like that, well, if a police officer pulls that person over, that felon over, they're going to say, hey, look, felon, you're the only person in the car. Here's a handgun. You're committing a crime. And so we have to take extra steps to guard against, shared vehicles is the other big one where I see a lot of issues come up.
Yeah. And arguably too, let's not even go into shared vehicles. Let's say that it's my car. you're in the car, you're a convicted felon, my pistol is in the glove box in front of you. Maybe you don't even know it's there, but that's really easy for an officer to construe as being in your possession because it is so much closer and more accessible to you than to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So kind of our pro tip here is if you're in a vehicle, make sure it's in your exclusive possession. Now let's go over to houses because while, you know, it would be a lifetime prohibition under federal law, Texas law is a little bit more lenient. Let's assume that this 5-year period has elapsed just to make it as ambiguous as possible. The advice still stands. You know, felons shouldn't have access to firearms. Best practices is to keep them locked up in a place that only, you know, lawful people can access, hidden in a place where the felon doesn't know about it. But that same argument that only the people who are authorized to have access to the firearms should have authorized access to the firearms. And you don't want because at the end of the day, we don't want our friend or family member or, you know, relative to get in trouble with possession of a firearm. So keeping it in your exclusive control is extremely important.
Yeah, biometric safes that you only have the, you know, access code to. These are all really good practices. And I think there's one more sort of tip that in practice we have to talk about, and that's what if your loved one who you're living with is actually still on probation or still on parole? It could be a condition of that probation or parole that they not have firearms in the home. Particularly parolees, they lose a lot of rights when it comes to personal privacy. I mean, that parole officer can come over and take a look and ask questions. And so if you are really, really interested in protecting your loved one, which I hope you are if you're allowing them to live with you, it might be a situation where, I mean, you de facto do lose some gun rights while they're living with you, while they're on parole, because you may want to dispossess yourself of those firearms in the home. If that's going to violate their parole, they're going to head back to prison. You might want to loan those out for the time that they're on parole and living with you, because again, it doesn't affect you. You're not going to get in trouble, but do you want your son, daughter, spouse to head back to TDCJ? Probably not.
No, and that's a great discussion, but we want to thank you for watching. If you enjoy this content, hit the like button, consider subscribing, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video.
And please keep your questions and comments going in the section below. We're trying to answer them in future videos. And until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.